A bee dee doo bee dee da boo dee 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 doo bee dee da boo doo 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 doo.
So we're here in the Chester Beatty Library, home to the collection of the great Sir Alfred Chester Beatty. And Beatty's story is really a remarkable one. And that story starts in New York at the end of the 19th century. One of the earliest anecdotes we have about Beatty is that at the age of 10 he was at an auction with his father. And he'd seen a beautiful mineral sample, a piece of pink calcite, and he really wanted to buy it, and he only had 15 cents in his pocket. So he sat in the front row with his dad, and when that lot came up, his hand shot up and he bid 10 cents. And all the other men in the room were so touched by this young boy trying to bid his 10 cents that they wouldn't bid against him, to the great annoyance of the auctioneer, who said, "Oh, you've been outbid by babes and sucklings." Beatty became a mining engineer. He graduated from the Columbia School of Mines in 1898, so that was an important time. The end of the 19th century was a really interesting time in the history of mining in America. He decided he was going to head west to Colorado, and he took the train to Denver with $200 in his pocket. Life was a little more expensive than he thought there, and he couldn't get a job as a young engineer. So he resorted to working as a mucker. So he literally started from the bottom up in the mining trade. But of course, Beatty graduated very quickly to become manager of a mine, and he made a name for himself really quickly. Within sort of 9 months, it was known that he had spotted a good vein of gold in one of the mines he was working at. And from there, his reputation gradually built as a young mining consultant. Around 1902, the end of 1902, the unions were really making their voices heard in the mining world in America. It was a very interesting time, but as yet the mines in Colorado hadn't been unionized. However, there were really nasty, violent tactics being used to try and coerce miners into joining the unions. When Beatty's own life was threatened by the Western Federation of Miners, he decided he would take action, and he went into Denver and he visited the offices of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and there he spoke to the infamous or celebrated James McParland. And McParland at the time was in his late 60s, and he suggested to Beatty, between them they worked out that they were going to send a bodyguard to Beatty's mine. And this comprised 6 gunfighters. And McParland recommended that Beatty hire Texan gunfighters. They were going to be expensive, but it was worth the money. Fights broke out, terrible fights broke out. And one of the tactics, if you like, of the mine owners and Beatty was, well, we're going to counteract the terrorism on the part of the unions with terrorism of our own. So they would pick fights with the rebels, with the guys they knew who were causing trouble. And of course, these guys were big, strong labourers, but they weren't trained fighters. So when they were set up against the hired fighters, they didn't stand a chance. And the message filtered through. Beatty's own life was threatened more than once. There was one particular episode where he was just travelling down in the mine shaft with an Irish miner called Mike O'Neill, and you signalled up to the guy operating the lift what shaft you want, what level you wanted to get out, and they had indicated that they wanted to be let out at the 3rd level, but the lift shaft plunged out of control. It was let plunge towards the bottom of the mine shaft. Now, clearly the guys had seconds to react. Beatty realised, and so did O'Neill, realised what was happening. Beatty said, the minute we hit the bottom, dive, because he remembered there was a water sump at the bottom of that particular shaft. With literally, as the lift shaft hit the bottom, it exploded into pieces. The guys dove out. Miraculously, they were saved and made their way back up, really ready to kill the guy operating the lift, but he fled, never to be seen again. Beatty moved to London in 1912. For personal reasons, but also because London was really the centre of the mining world. He set up a company called Selection Trust, which went on to become a conglomerate of many, many companies assessing and refinancing mines in Africa, gold mines in northwest Africa, copper in the Rhodesias, other mines in Yugoslavia, in Russia. So he had this great network all over the world. In parallel, and you wonder where he really found the time, but in parallel with that, his collecting became ever more sophisticated. As he had more money to spend, as he travelled more to Asia, to the Middle East, he started to collect more and more specialist material, and he had the best advice available to him at the time in that regard, because he always focused on quality and rarity. At one time, and this would seem unethical to those of us working in museums today, but at one time he had practically all the curators in the British Museum on retainer, because of course they had great contacts throughout the world. So when works came on the market, Beatty was often one of the first to know. One of the great acquisitions made by Beatty was at the end of the 1920s. There was a cache of early papyrus found in Egypt, and Beatty was given an option to buy. Now, Beatty had agents on the ground to check this for him, and he also had alerted the curators in the British Museum. So the agents were checking the material and, in those days, sending telegrams back to the British Museum. And Beatty always liked to use code in telegrams, even in his business life, in his personal life, and in this case, in his collecting life as well. So, for example, the telegrams would go saying, "Silver mine, rich, 3 shafts." And the simple code was, well, mines meant manuscripts, rich meant old, and the number of shafts indicated the century. So the agents were saying, there's this cache of papyrus, very old, we believe it to be authentic, and probably 3rd century. This became a really, really famous acquisition by Beatty. It made the headlines in the London Times, and it turned out, as the material was catalogued, it turned out to be the most important stash, if you like, of early biblical material made up to that date. And here in the library we have some of the earliest copies of the New Testament. We have the earliest codex, or early book if you like. A codex is an early book of the 4 Gospels bound together, the earliest Acts of the Apostles and letters of St. Paul, making this a very important part of our collection. Beatty had acted as an informal advisor to Winston Churchill during the Second World War, and the two were in fact good friends. When, after the Second World War, the Conservatives were voted out of government, Beatty was pretty shocked. And the Labour government, of course, was voted in. Now, Beatty's on record as saying that he found the bureaucracy of the Labour government very tiresome. And also the foreign currency restrictions that were in place really didn't suit him, because now, after the war, he was also spending a lot of time in Nice. He was an elderly man already at this stage, and he had this lung condition, so he needed to spend the winter in warmer climes. Beatty's son already had bought a house in Ireland. So Beatty decided, and it was quite a significant move, to move lock, stock and barrel in 1950 to Dublin, bringing his entire collection with him, to the enormous dismay of the British authorities and particularly of the British Museum. He brought with him not just his collection, but his librarian, his publisher, his bank manager, and his book conservator. And he bought a house, a residence for himself on Aylesbury Road in Dublin, and he bought a site on Shrewsbury Road just around the corner, and it was on Shrewsbury Road that he built his own Chester Beatty Library, which was open first for scholars and then increasingly open to members of the public. The Irish authorities really looked after Beatty. They really understood the importance of this man coming to Ireland. He was made the first honorary Irish citizen, and when Beatty died in 1968, he was granted a state funeral, which was quite exceptional. Beatty, in an extraordinary act of generosity, left his entire library collection to the Irish nation. And today it's one of the national cultural institutions.